So for years in a seminary context, one of my favorite classes to teach is on the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are obviously interesting for students and interesting for all Christians for the obvious reason that these are the only 4 documents we have that tell us about the actual earthly life and ministry and teachings of Jesus. And so we spend a lot of time, rightly so, in these 4 books, and people often have a favorite. You ask them what their favorite gospel is. A lot of people will say John, for obvious reasons, some like Matthew, Luke, or Mark, or what have you. But in the middle of reading these 4 accounts, it becomes quickly apparent to the average reader that, yes, they tell the story of Jesus, but they tell the story of Jesus in different ways. And some ways they tell the story of Jesus different ways in such a manner that it looks like there may be a contradiction, maybe some sort of discrepancy where one gospel author says one thing and another gospel author says another thing. And this is one of the most common objections to the Gospels, and one of the most common objections to the Bible as a whole is that, look, the Bible contradicts itself. In particular, the Gospels contradict themselves. They say one thing in one place, and they say another thing in another place, and these things can't be reconciled, so skeptics say. But I think you'll quickly discover, upon closer examination, that a lot of these apparent contradictions evaporate really quickly when you understand a number of things. Let me just mention a few of these things. First, you have to realize that when you do history in the ancient world, you don't always do it exactly like we would do history in the modern world. We tend to think that if you're going to tell a historical story in the modern world, you always have to say it in chronological order. You always have to quote people exactly and verbatim. And I think you would know that in the ancient world, that's not how history was done. Sometimes stories are rearranged in order for thematic reasons. Sometimes people, when they said something, you would summarize what they said or reword it in words that your audience understands. And so you would paraphrase it, rework it to make it more understandable to your audience. And so once you understand that, you realize very quickly that a lot of these so-called contradictions evaporate rather quickly. The other thing to realize about these apparent contradictions in the Gospels is that leaving out a story is not the same as a contradiction. Some people think, well, one Gospel account has this story, but the other Gospel doesn't have it. Well, that's not a contradiction. You have to remember that a historian can't say everything, right? They have a limited amount of space by which to tell their story of Jesus. And so they're going to be selective for their own context and their own reasons. Some stories they'll include, some stories they won't. But at the end of the day, when you realize you can't say it all, simply omitting a story is not the same thing as saying there's an actual contradiction. And so what I usually encourage people to do when they see something that looks like a discrepancy is to recognize that they're not the first ones to ever read these Gospels, right? People have studied these books for 2,000 years. These may be the most studied books in the history of the world. That's not an exaggeration. There's probably no books in the history of the world that have been more picked apart, more examined than the Gospels. And I think it's reassuring to know that they've stood the test of time, that when you look at the details, you do the historical work, and you're careful with the text, you'll quickly discover that what looks like apparent contradictions actually have answers, and they've had answers for a very long time.